Good morning. Morning. Can we hear? Am I on? Am I? Okay, good. Okay, so we'll be talking about chapter 7 today. Any questions from last week that you want to still address? Okay, who would like to read chapter 7 for the class? Okay, thanks, Joseph.
A good name is better than fine perfume, and a day of death better than a day of birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. Frustration is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. It is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to a song of fools. Like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. It too is meaningless. Extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. The end of a matter is better than its beginning, and patience is better than pride. Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the wrath of fools. Do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing, and benefits those who see the sun. Wisdom is a shelter, as money is a shelter. But the advantage of knowledge is this: wisdom preserves those who have it. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider this: God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore no one can discover anything about the future. In this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these. The righteous perish in their righteousness, and the wicked live long in their wickedness. Do not be over righteous, neither be over wise. Why destroy yourself? Do not be over wicked, and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? It is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. Wisdom makes one wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. Indeed, there is no one on earth who is righteous, no one who does what is right and never sins. Do not pay attention to every word people say, or you may hear your servant cursing you. For you know in your heart that many times you yourself have cursed others. All this I tested by wisdom, and I said, I am determined to be wise, but this was beyond me. Whatever exists is far off and most profound. Who can discover it? So I trained my mind to understand, to investigate and to search out wisdom and the scheme of things, and to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. Look, says the teacher, that is what I have discovered, adding one thing to another to discover the schemes of things, while I still searching but not finding. I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. This only have I found: God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes.
All righty, thank you. So, any particular questions in chapter 7 that you want addressed? You want verse 28 explained? Why don't you read that for us again? Okay, gotcha. We'll definitely talk about that. Any other verses you want to discuss?
So
You have a verse associated with that question, or just a general question? General question. Okay. We'll write seeking wisdom, folly. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Okay. Yes. Okay. I wonder if anybody was going to get to that one. Or not overly wicked. Okay. Oh, yes, ma'am? Okay, what's your question on 17? What is, read verse 17 for us. Okay, gotcha. Okay, yeah, so I'll have that on here with the 16 and 17. All right. Any other questions? Okay. So we're at the halfway point of Ecclesiastes. So 6, 10, 11, and 12 are the center point of the book here. And I want you to see that he asks a question that takes you back to chapter 1 and verse 3. What advantage do we have here? And he says in 6, 10, and 11, and 12 here, let me turn the page. Verse 12, for who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime, during the few years of his futile life? For who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun here? So he's asking this question about what is good, and then in chapter 7, he's addressing that. So in your translations, it'll say better than, better than, better than. That's just the same Hebrew word for good. So what's good? And he lists off all these things that are good. Okay, so I want you to see that here. But then I want to ask, since nobody wanted to ask this question here, how is verse 1 true? A good name is better than a good ointment, and a day of one's death is better than a day of one's birth. Who would like to address that? Okay, so we'll write here. Man, that just makes so much noise. A day of death better. Okay, so one answer was no longer living in a sinful world. Sinful. Okay. Get your reward.
If the second half ties into the first part of the verse, the good name is better than precious ointment. Well, the day you're born, I mean, there's 4 or 5 people that know you, that you're, your mom, your dad, maybe grandma, grandpa, siblings, whatever. But the day you die, hopefully a lot more people know you. And your name, I don't know how to say it, but maybe you're more recognized as your death than you are your birth. If that makes sense.
Yes, that's why I'm going to write up here, summarize, Brandon is right. So I'm just going to write it, so we'll just have it nice and clear here. The grave is a better teacher than the cradle. And Brandon's exactly right. When you're born, you have no reputation. That's it. But your death, you have accumulated reputation, which is why we need to live our life backwards. If we know we're going to die, what kind of reputation are we going to leave in this world? Are we going to be known as a person who was petty, a liar, cheater, dishonest? Or are we going to be known as a person who was willing to sacrifice, willing to help, willing to give? That's why he's saying to you, it really is better to the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. See, then he goes on, it's better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, because that's the end of every man. And the living take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for when a face is sad, a heart may be happy. The mind of the wise is in the house of mourning, while the mind of fools is in the house of pleasure. It's better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man than one to listen to the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, so is the laughter of fools, and this too is futility. So all 6 of these verses go together, and it really helps us understand death. Since we're all going to die, how should we live our life? Since we're all going to die, that's just a given, what should we do? Now, one option, since we're all going to die, is to deny death. The other option is to embrace death. And we see both these options played out in our society ad nauseum. The majority of people in our culture deny death. This is why we only want to see pretty people and not ugly people. Because ugly people are going to die sooner than pretty people, hypothetically. This is why we want to see young people and not old people. Because again, young people have the advantage of being more pretty than old people, and they're going to live longer, so they're not going to die. So again, we're avoiding death. This is why we emphasize in our society health and wealth and prosperity, and the sky is the limit, and we can accomplish anything and everything if we just put our mind to it, because everything's endless, because we're not going to die. Which is why it always makes the news about how we can push death further and further and further back. This is why we try to emphasize how great medical technology has grown, so we can push death further, further, further and back. But that's just a lie. We're all going to die. That's just the truth of the matter. If we're all going to die, how should we do this here? When you go to a funeral, you can certainly look at that person in the casket and say, I know them, I don't know them. Well, they died because of, and you list off all the reasons they died in your mind. But that's just a foolish way to approach things. You should go to a funeral, look at the person in that coffin, and say, they're dead, I'm going to be dead, I don't know when I'm going to die, what should I do different? I mean, really, how much TV can you watch? How many shows can you binge? How many states can you visit? How many miles can you drive that fill up the emptiness in your life that will help you avoid death? None. We're all going to die. If we're going to die, then how should we live? And that's the question Solomon wants you to ask yourself. How are we going to live? So, in 7 through 12, he gives us some ideas about how people try to avoid death, try to deny death here. He says in verse 7, for oppression makes a wise man mad, and bribe corrupts the heart. So some people try to deny death by pursuing money. And you see it in our society. If we just get enough money, we can get the happiness we need, and we can prolong our life. And on some level, we do acknowledge the truth of that you can live longer if you are richer. Poor people die at a younger age as a general truth. There are plenty of exceptions, but that's just the truth. If you have money, you can have better health. You can have better food, better exposure to medical stuff, and you can live healthier longer. So trying to get money to avoid death doesn't really do you any good, because all you can do is push death away for a little while, and then still you're going to die. So seeking after corruption just isn't going to do you any good. The end of the matter is better than the beginning. Patience of spirit is better than a haughtiness of spirit here. The end of our life is better than our beginning of our life because we'll have lived our life, we'll have made choices and decided whether we're going to serve God or not serve God. Do not be eager in your heart, in verse 9, to be angry, for anger resides in the bosom of fools. People try to get angry, trying to say, this is how I'm going to deny death. Death won't take me because of whatever. Joseph?
Your version says bosom, mine says lap. Is there a difference?
Yes and no. You want to remember this is poetry, and so for that, there really is no difference. You know, he's just trying to say that anger resides in the bosom of fools, so the chest, it is in that person here.
So it's attitude?
Yes. So in verse 10 he says, do not say, why is it that the former days were better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask about this. So let's stop there for a second. I can't spell this word, so would somebody spell nostalgia for me? N? All right, good. Nostalgia. So we all know what that is. We all understand looking at previous times, previous experiences, and remembering this feeling we have. But all of us should be old enough to realize that if we could go back in time, our life would not be better. So for me, I grew up listening to music from the 70s. So I like that. It always gives me a lot of really good feelings about that here. But I know if I could go back and live then, it wouldn't be any better than living now. Because there were just as much problems, corruption, sin as there is now here. And all of us have these feelings of nostalgia. We remember what it was like to live in our first house, or when we first were married, or when we first were dating, or we got our first job, and we have all these good, wonderful feelings about this stuff. And we think if we could just go back here, that might be the feelings we could get again. And yet we're old enough to realize, most of us, maybe all of us, that that's not true. Nostalgia is just ephemeral. It's just an illusion. It's not really true. And God gives us that feeling because He's trying to point us to something that's lacking in our life. Because there's something that's at the edge of your mind. Like when you watch a show and you're like, wow, I wish I could have relationships like that. I wish we could have these sort of things here. And you know in one part of your mind that that's not true because that's not how things work out in real life. But in another part of your mind, you wish it did work out. And so you're like, why can't we have this? And that's part of what God gives us so we realize there's something that we're missing in this life. Because sin has destroyed everything. Destroyed everything from molecular level all the way up to emotional level. It's just all been destroyed. And Christ is repairing things, but we're still lacking so much. And we have these senses of nostalgia. If I could only have this, because God's trying to remind you, that's not what you need. What you need is beyond death. So you need to live your life knowing that you're going to die. Because when you do die and you're with me, well, then you'll see things for what they really are, and you'll have what you were lacking. All of us at some point in our life have recognized there was a hole in us, that there was something missing, which is why we respond to Christ. We're like, I can't take care of this, I can't resolve this, I can't fix this, I can't do this, and I just need something to fill this emptiness. And you get Christ, you come out of the waters baptism, you're excited, you're pumped up, and life is filled with infinite possibilities here. We need to have that feeling. We need to remind ourselves that Christ is greater than all our problems. He can fill all the emptiness inside us. And more than that, He can fill the emptiness inside of our neighbors, our friends, our families, if they're just willing to acknowledge there's emptiness. But of course, people deny death. You can't do anything about that. If they don't want to go to a funeral, if they don't believe they're going to die, no matter how much you say it to them, you can't make them believe this. However, Christians should be people that embrace death. We're going to die, and if we're going to die, how are we going to live our life? Oftentimes, as people get older, we start running out of energy, and then we give up. And God is saying, no, I don't want you to give up. You have got to persevere to the very end. And we have a tendency to think about, okay, persevering is just about me resisting these sins. Well, that might have been true when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. But once you get to a certain age, you're like, okay, I just don't lust after this person. I just don't have the energy to get angry at this person. I don't have the energy to do this. And so then the problem becomes, am I going to take what little energy I have and give it to God and do what's going to hurt me? Give to this person knowing that it's going to cause me pain, and the little sleep I used to get is now going to go away because I served somebody else. Am I going to persevere until the very moment of my death? Because if I'm embracing death, I want the day of my death to be much better than the day of my birth, which is what Solomon wants us to think about. Thoughts or questions? Yes, sir?
Number 10, do not say, why were the old days better than these? It reminds me of this other saying is, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, so why, like the 1800s and the 1700s or the 1900s, all the problems were still there, even though the things have changed.
Mm-hmm.
Development, but all the problems are still the same.
All right. Anybody else? Well, I would, not being as old as some of you here, I don't know. I have noticed that I have less energy, so I've walked all my life, and I'm more aware of time than most people. So I know how fast I walk, and I have noticed that my speed of walking has slowed down, the last 5 years or whatever. So I have less energy, even though in my mind I'm going as fast as I ever was before, my normal speed here. So I would think that as we get older, we really have just got to trust God and say, okay, I'm just going to do this even though I don't want to do that. Which is why the perseverance is so very hard. Because it's just easy for us to be worn down and say, I'm too tired, I'm too sick, I don't have this, and lose our motivation. Because the young are filled with motivation. They're on fire for things, but as we get older, we lose our motivation and things become less important. And we need to still hold on to our motivation, still hold on to the Spirit moving through us, which is our struggle. It's just easy to give up. Yes, ma'am.
Let me add to that. I know people that in their old age begin to despise their life. They wanted to die. They no longer saw life, breathing, as a holy thing. They wanted to go be with God, which is not bad, but it's not embracing what God is giving you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think until we breathe our last, we should be in awe, grateful, no matter what our circumstances are. And there's a reason for us to be here.
Job said so much truth when he said, shall I take good from the Lord and not evil from the Lord here? Shall I accept this from God and not this from God? Because it's the same God who gives me both. So who am I to say he was right and smart to give me this blessing, but he was stupid and short-sightful to give me this struggle? It's not my place. And we get to an age where we think we know what's best for us, and we have more answers, because truthfully, we're surrounded by people who are just stupid. You're surrounded by all these people, and you're like, seriously, get a clue. Just do this, and your life will be better. But they won't listen to you here. So then we get this idea, inflated sense of, well, we're pretty smart. But we're not. Okay? I mean, being the smartest of monkeys isn't anything to be proud of. Okay? It's just like, okay, great. God is God, and He is not us, and He is just infinitely more than us, and we have got to trust Him. Which we can see how that's important when you're young. Trust God, and you'll overcome these temptations. But we lose that insight as we get older, because God is still saying, I need you to trust me, and I need you to try. And we think, well, I can't do what I used to do, and God's understanding that. He's not saying do what you did 20 years ago. He's saying do today what I give for you today. Don't give up, just do and persevere, which is just hard. But then we should be expecting that. Work is work. Yes, ma'am.
So this may be more of a philosophical thing, but I've been told that it's sinful to think away. I was talking to these insurance people, every year, and they always offer the cancer policy, and I always turn it down. And the lady said to me, "Oh, are you sure? Because you said that." And I said, "You know what? If I get cancer, I'm not seeking treatment. I'm just going to go." And she looked at me like I was crazy. And she said, "What?" And I said, "My husband died of cancer. My mother died of cancer. My sister died of cancer. My dad died of cancer. I watched all of them go through, especially my sister, all these treatments, pain, exhaustion, nausea, not being able to get out of bed for days because of the pain." I said, "I don't want it." I said, if I get cancer, I get cancer, and I'm just going to go." And she's like, "Okay, then." And I've talked to a couple people about that, and some of them tell me, well, that's sinful, because if you can live longer, you can serve God longer. And so it comes down to a question of, well, you should do that for God. You should go through all that cancer treatment for God, so that you can serve Him longer. But it's kind of like, if the cancer is terminal, why? I mean, is that a bad thing? Biblically.
Pardon me while we take a excursion here. In the 1900s, it was midwives who brought forth the majority of babies into the world. In the 1930s and 40s, the U.S. government got involved, military got involved, and we decided that doctors should do this. And they changed everything around, and now the men should control these sort of things here. And we changed how we give birth to our culture here, which caused all kinds of problems that we're in denial about and whatnot here. But after that, midwives sort of tanked. But then in the 60s and 70s, they started coming back up here because people started saying, listen, why should this guy say this is the way to give birth when 90% of the rest of the world gives birth without a doctor, so maybe there's something the way God had it planned here. So you have a lot more growth of midwives, and you have a lot more growth of birth doulas. So from the Greek word for servant, so people are going to help you give birth because it's a natural sort of thing here. Now, in this day and age, we have the converse, we have death doulas, people that are going to help you pass away peacefully here. And again, it used to be when I was a young man that you were going to die in agony in a hospital. You were just going to get sick enough, they were going to run you to the hospital, and then you were just going to eventually die, and that was it. Which is why we had legislation passed to say, okay, if I don't want to die this way, if I don't want to be resuscitated, if I don't want all these life measures put forth, I can make these changes, and we can do that here. And then we've seen the growth of hospice, where people are saying, well, I just want to die at home. I can die with what I feel is a certain level of dignity, but I can certainly die around my family, and I don't need to spend all these resources for something that's of no value. So Christians are going to run the gambit about death here, and if you want to spend the money to do this, fine. If you don't want to spend the money, fine here. What's important is that we're not denying our death either way. Christians need to embrace our death and say, this is what I'm going to do here. And We can certainly have an opinion at the moment, but it may change when we actually come to the crossroads and we have to make that decision. When it becomes real, we're like, oh, I want to change this, I want to do this, and that's okay. We really should be kind enough to give people the flexibility to change because that's respectful. Yes, and so Ms. Wano is saying that, physically we just don't have the ability to do certain things here. And I understand that, and I agree with that here. But there are plenty of people who physically can do something and have already checked out and have already given up because it's work. If it's painful to get out of bed, well, it's painful to get out of bed, so you might as well just not get out of bed here. But we spent our whole life overcoming things that were difficult, challenging, painful. I assume the majority of men here have spent any number of years going to work when you were sick. Because if you didn't work, you didn't get paid. If you didn't get paid, that threw the family into a huge problem. So you just persevered and worked through that here. Now, of course, things are a lot better. People have sick days, people have personal time, people have this, but most of you have all worked plenty of jobs where they didn't give that, they didn't care about that. If you didn't show up, you didn't get paid, and then people didn't eat. So you just worked through the pain here. And we have that experiences when we're younger. We just need to keep that experience as we get older and not give up, because that's what he wants to do. We just have got to embrace our death and wait for it towards the end here. Okay, so let's look at 11 through 14. So wisdom along with an inheritance is good, an advantage to those who see the Son, for wisdom is protection just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. So he's again emphasizing that wisdom is good because it provides protection in life. Making a wise choice is always better than making a foolish choice. Just like having money is better than not having money because it gives you options, gives you choices, gives you protection here. Verse 13 and 14. Consider the work of God. Who is able to straighten what he has bent? In the days of prosperity be happy, but in the days of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man will not discover anything that will be after him. You really do need to highlight those verses. You really do need to memorize those verses because we deny the truth of those verses all the time. If God has made something crooked, we cannot make it straight. And what the author is trying to tell us is that God is in charge. We are not in charge. We have, by observation, discovered things that we call laws, as if to say it always has to happen this way. But this is just our observation. And many of us have done observations. We know that you can observe something this many times, and that's not enough of a sample to say it's always going to be this way. Because if you observe it almost an infinite amount of times, you'll see exceptions to that here. And life is filled with those exceptions. Life is filled with the exceptions that you do evil and good things happen. You do good and bad things happen. We need to realize that God is in charge And He has given us our limitations, and we have got to accept those limitations, like Juan was saying. The mind wants to do things, the body just can't do it. Okay, rather than being angry at God, saying, I have all this, why don't you let me do this? We just need to accept it from God and realize that God is the one in charge, which we give lip service to. We say that God is in charge, but really we say God is in charge along in harmony with me, because I have wisdom and I think this is the right thing. You know, God, if I had this money, I could give this away. I could do wonderful things here, God. Why don't you do this for me? God, if I was able to do a little bit more, I could accomplish great things for your kingdom. Why don't you let me do these things for you? God, it makes sense. And we just don't realize that God is here and we're not. And we don't see the true picture. We do not see reality as it really exists. We see this pew, we knock on that and say, well, there you go. It's there. But of course, we've had enough science to know that it's filled with atoms and there's huge amounts of space between it, so it's just works out that way because that's what God wants to work it out. But as soon as God takes His power away, my hand would just go right through it here. Because God's in charge and we are not in charge here, which is what we want to remember as we read the rest of this. So look what he says in verse 15. I have seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness. Do not be excessively righteous, and do not be overly wise. Why should you ruin yourself? Do not be excessively wicked. Do not be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp one thing, and also not let go of the other. For the one who fears God comes forth from both of them. So let me start off by saying, I certainly could be wrong about what I'm going to tell you. There are no easy answers on what he is saying here. What we do know for a truth is that, excluding these verses here, the rest of the Bible consistently says, don't sin. Okay? It says, do good things will happen to you. But the Bible also acknowledges that there isn't that level of consistency that we think should exist. I think every time I knock on that, it should make a sound, and my hand should not pass through that. And I think I could tell my children and my children's children, and 1,000 years later, if this still existed, it should do just that here. But that's not how life works. There are all kinds of exceptions that we don't realize here, and we think we control the universe because we have discovered laws. We take that same mentality and we apply it to the Bible. We say there are spiritual laws. And the spiritual laws are this: if you trust God, if you do good, good things will happen to you. And that means the converse is also true. If bad things are happening to you, reverse back, that means you did bad things. So we say, okay, well, we got the book of Job, that can't be true, because we learned that here. And our personal experiences, we learn that, okay, that's not always true. Bad things can happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people. Well, what should we do here? But still, in the church, we think that we can control God, though we don't say it this way. We can control God by doing the right things. If I do these things, God is somehow obligated to respond this way. If I pray to God, He's obligated to answer my prayers. If I do a good deed, God is obligated to have something good happen to me. Because that's the way the universe is supposed to work. That's what God says. You reap what you sow. And we can find plenty of verses that will support that mentality. And while on the one hand we think, okay, I can understand there's some exceptions, we don't think those exceptions apply to us because God should do what He said He's going to do, and God has tied His hands and bound Himself that if I do these things, He has to do these things, and God says, no. That's not the way. That's not the way I operate. Okay? I am telling you straight up that you can do good things and bad things happen to you. You can do bad things and good things happen to you because I'm in control of the universe. As a general rule, I want you to do good things. because you'll have a good end. As a general rule, seeking wisdom is better than seeking foolishness, because better things will happen to you. But don't think for a moment that because you seek after wisdom and you've pursued it wholeheartedly, that good things have to happen to you. I am above wisdom, God. Wisdom is not above me. So there's an old philosophical question about what's good. Is something good because God says it's good? Or is it the other way around? That it's good in and of itself and God just acknowledges that it's good. So our world operates under the principle that God just acknowledges that it's good because it's already good, as if good exists above God. That's not the truth. Something is good solely and wholly because God says it is good. And that is the only reason. And so God is above wisdom. God is above all these things here. Wisdom does not control God. Laws do not control God. Nothing controls God. And if that's the case, well then, don't think for a moment if you're excessively wise, you're going to have this outcome in life, as if God is bound to give you this outcome. Not the case. And then the whole excessively wicked. Don't think that if you're excessively wicked, these things are going to happen to you here. Because God, again, isn't bound that way. If He wants to bless this person, He can bless this person. If He wants to prolong their life, He can do that. He is not bound by us, but we think He is. Let's take something more personal in our society here, in our fellowship here. If a person says in that pew during Mark's sermon, I want to get baptized, we're like, okay, great. They're an adult. We've acknowledged they're sinful. We've seen their sinful actions. And they're walking down the pew. They have a heart attack and die. Are they going to go to heaven? Well, you'd have any other people say, no, they didn't get baptized. They're not going to heaven. People say, well, no, of course they could because they had the right heart. And we go back and forth in all these debates here. And it's immaterial because God can do whatever God wants to do. And we need to realize that. God says, if you get baptized, you'll be saved. Okay. But He doesn't say, I can't save somebody some other way. If it turns out at the very end of the world, when judgment comes, that God wants to save everybody, He can do that. Because He's God and He is in charge of creation, not us. But we think because we have a society where we have laws and rules and regulations, and nobody's above the law, that God's not above the law. Well, that's not the way it is. God creates things, and He is trying to tell us through these things, these passages right here, that you don't understand the universe like you think you understand. You think if you do these things, this has got to happen. That's not the truth. It should be a good thing for you to pursue. It should be that good things do happen, but there's no guarantee. But you don't know. What should you have? Well, He says in verse 18, it is good that you grasp one thing and also not let go of the other, for the one who fears God comes forth with both of them. The idea is to fear God. The idea is to trust God, which of course is the rub. We like to trust God, but we don't want to trust God, because if you trust God, you've got to get rid of your control. Okay, when you trust somebody else, you have to control. You have to let them control. When I was at school, in preaching school, you're filled with all these guys who are dedicating their life to God, want to be ministers. And we would go on mission trips 3 times a year. It always involved us driving 1,000+ miles, some congregation, some town or whatever here. And you want to see the jockeying that's going on with 30-year-olds, some 40-year-old men who have families. It's about who's going to drive. And they're all like, oh, no, I've got to drive because I can't trust anybody else, because and it's all this stuff here. Now, again, I told you I like to walk. I was more than happy to let them drive and fight it out because I could just sleep the whole time. And so it worked out well for me, but for them, they just couldn't give up control for a moment. And you see that in our life, that we don't want to give up control. But if we don't give up control, how are we really trusting God? So we're in this body we have now, and through decisions of our own or decisions of other people, we're broken down and it's not functioning the way it should be, and we're not able to do what we think we should be able to do, And are we going to trust God? Or are we going to be bitter about God? Are we going to say, God, why did you do this? Because I could do so much more if you let me go with this. Or are we just going to say, God, I just trust you? You know, what are we going to do? And so this whole section is about fearing God, which is to say, trust God, which is to say, let go of control. Because we don't control anything. Again, I think I control my breathing, and I control my heart up until it flips out. We go to the doctor, it's like, oh, what's going on? I don't know. I mean, you ever had your muscles spasm, and you look at it, it's like, wow. And you're thinking in your mind, stop. And it's not doing anything. It's like, why is it doing that? Because we don't really control things. We just operate in the illusion that we do control things here. Wait, you wanted to say something? I know all that. I know all that. So are you wanting to disagree with what I said? Are you wanting to disagree with what I said? No, I just need to understand. Are you wanting to disagree with what I said? Well, that's okay. You know, sometimes we want to realize that you just have to assume that people know the Scriptures. So we just need to assume that people have heard these verses about baptism. I taught most of you Gospel of John, at least the first 12 chapters, so I know you know that. So we just have got to grow past this basic level. We have got to stop saying our ABCs and actually move on to something deeper, which is why Ecclesiastes is so challenging, because it is nothing but deep stuff here. Jesse?
Charles, I think we might ought to be careful if we say that God is going to trust God if He wants to send everybody to heaven after it's all over with, or send everybody to hell. What you said, I'm not getting it quite right, but I know that when Jesus comes with His mighty angels and flaming fire, dealing out retribution to those who did not know God and then those who have not obeyed the gospel, Jesus Christ will forever be condemned. We have to trust God in what He has told us
Mm-hmm.
and believe it. And I don't think God's going to change His mind there at the last minute with all the scriptures that we have telling us what's going to happen when He comes again.
Well, and I agree with you to a certain extent, Jesse. I don't think God's going to change His mind. But what we need to accept is God could change His mind. Because that's the whole point of saying the Bible teaches if you do good things will happen to you. Pursue wisdom, God will bless you. And you reap what you sow. So there are plenty of verses that we could point that out. Proverbs is filled with an endless amount of those verses here. But then there are just a handful of places that say, okay, you do good things and bad things happen to you. Job is an example here. So I just want us to realize that God is in charge. And we can't say that God has His hands bound because of this law or this commandment. Okay? God is always going to be faithful. He's always going to do what He's going to do here. And laws are not above God. God is above everything else. And so whatever He does, it's in His nature, and He's going to do that. And we have just got to accept that sometimes we don't know.
But God will keep His word.
Yes, He will keep His word. Amen. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I always think about, when Jesus, He was about to be crucified, and He said, don't you know that I can ask God to give me 12 Hebrew ravens right now, He will deliver me? Well, He could have done that. And somehow, all those prophecies and promises about the Savior would have, God would have taken care of that, even though He delivered Jesus. So, we just don't understand.
That's a really good point. I can appreciate that here. I hadn't thought about that. Good point. Anything else? Okay, I only got 10 minutes left, so I just got, oh, Cassie, you had a question? No, go ahead. I got time. I could cram these verses into like that, saying, trust God and move on. Go ahead.
When you were talking about verses 16 and 17, and I know we went into this really philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that really just kind of helped me simplify it is when I thought about the Pharisees. You know, they thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were the pinnacle of righteousness. And right here he talks about not being overly righteous, overly wise. And we see how that was to their detriment. And for me, that if I think of it that way, it makes it to where I want to do the right thing, but I don't want to do the right thing so much that I put my nose up at other people and their situation because I don't know.
Good points. All right. Anything else? Okay, we'll look at the last few verses here. He says in verse 19, wisdom strengthens a wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Indeed, there is not a righteous man on earth who continually does good and who never sins. That's the only verse that's quoted in the New Testament from Ecclesiastes. So Romans 3. Also, do not take seriously all words which are spoken, so that you will not hear your servant cursing you. We've all experienced the truth of that. For you also have realized that you likewise have many times cursed others. I tested all this with wisdom, and I said, I'll be wise, but it was far from me. What has been as remote and exceedingly mysterious, who can discover it? I directed my mind to know, to investigate, and seek wisdom and explanation, and to know the evil of folly and the foolishness of madness. And I discovered more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. One who is pleasing to God will escape from her, but the sinner will be captured by her. Behold, I have discovered this, says the preacher, adding one thing to another to find explanation, which I am still seeking, but have not found. I have found one man among 1,000, but I have not found a woman among all these. Behold, I have found only this, that God made men upright, but they have sought out many devices, many schemes here. So part of the difficulty for us with this is it's very easy to read Solomon there as a misogynist, somebody who hates women here. So it is possible that is being what Solomon's teaching here. I don't know. I don't have a super good explanation. It certainly could be possible that women here is being personified. So when you read in the book of Proverbs, both a good woman and a bad woman are personified as wisdom and folly. So you'll hear the terms dame, D-A-M-E, dame wisdom, dame folly. So lady wisdom, lady folly. That is used in Proverbs. And wisdom in Proverbs is referring to Christ as well here. So that's a possibility to what he is saying here about verse 26. And I discovered more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. One who is pleasing to God will escape from her, but the sinner will be captured by her, talking about folly. I have seen ministers and teachers say this is talking about marriage. You got to watch out for marriage here. I've seen people talk about this is talking about an adulterous woman. You got to watch out for the adulterous woman because if she captures your heart, like Proverbs talks about, she's going to make you miserable because she's going to cheat and this and that, cause all the problems here. I don't know. You know, I have a lot better answer on other things than this one. Yes, sir?
King Solomon was surrounded by women.
Mm-hmm.
He had concubines and wives, so many of them. That's probably another reason why he could have said this statement, because he was surrounded by them.
He certainly was. He definitely had more than he should have here. You know, he says, I have found one man among 1,000, but not found a woman among all these. The difficulty with verse 28 is, are we seeing a contrast, or are we seeing a growth? It's not the right word here. About humanity here. Contrast, male, female. So is Solomon trying to say, okay, I could find one righteous guy, but never found a righteous woman? It's always a possibility, he's clearly saying here. Or is he saying that, as a general rule, I could find one righteous person in 1,000, but not really a righteous person in 1,000 here? Sort of like when the crowd was saying to David and Saul, Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his 10,000s. We have a tendency to read that as if Saul was upset because they were saying David killed more than he did. But that wasn't the case at all. Saul was upset because they were saying David killed equal amount to Saul. So they were saying 1,000, 10,000, that they killed 10,000, so to speak, a large number here. So is he saying here that I could find 1 in 1,000, but not really find 1 in 1,000 here? Because is there really anybody who's righteous? And that's what he's already said. You know, he just said there wasn't anybody that was righteous. Verse 20 here. But of course, we know verse 29, but I found only this, that God made men upright, but they have sought out many devices, sought out many schemes here. We don't have the luxury of time, but we could certainly go through Ecclesiastes, and this chapter included, and make all kinds of comparisons to the first 3 chapters of Genesis that are going on, that he is making allusion to. Going on. Yes, sir?
I'd just like to say today, Charles, feels like there's more women who follow Jesus than men. It's like, we've had several baptisms of all
It is a truth. So I would affirm that as a gender divide, women are more righteous than men. Men are more lazy, more pond scum, more wimpy, more whatever here. They just want to be bums. Women are more willing to change, more willing to grow, more willing to do the things, at least in a spiritual sense. Now, both of those things lead to other problems ultimately here, but as a general rule throughout history, churches are composed more of women than men. And more women bring in people into the church than men. As a general rule, that's just the way it works out here. So I would take the tact, at least at the moment here, that what Solomon is saying in verse 28 is that he's not finding any righteous person at all. I have found one man among 1,000, but I have not found a woman among all these here. He's just saying, I'm not finding any righteous people because people are just not righteous. Nobody is really seeking after God. And of course, we understand this is hyperbole. We understand this is poetry. We understand this is wisdom. He is not, in a scientific, literal point of view, saying, out of the whole sphere of the earth, there's not a single righteous person. He's just saying, as a general rule, people are not righteous. So we can look at the time of Jeremiah. People thought they were righteous. They weren't righteous. That's why God destroyed the city. God destroyed the nation. Though there were righteous people in there. Even in the time of Elijah, which I think is something we should always keep in our mind, when Elijah looks at the whole nation and has gone around the whole nation, he thought he was the only righteous person left. And God says, I have reserved for myself 7,000 over here that haven't bowed a knee to Baal. Now, it certainly could be that he meant a literal 7,000. More likely, he just means a large number that I have that are still serving me. We don't see the totality of anything. And so we shouldn't think we're the only person or the last person that's this way here. But Solomon's trying to get us to understand, we are not righteous. If we're not righteous, what should we do? Back to verse 18, fear God. Trust God, give up your control, and let Him do these things here. And because we've got to give up control, we have got to embrace death because we can't push it off. We can't stop the day of our death. If God wants us to die, we're going to die. And if Satan wants to kill us and God doesn't allow it, we're just going to stay alive. Because God has all power, all authority, and He either allows something or He causes something. But He is in charge, and we are not in charge. Yes, ma'am? it is true. I'll put my wife on the spot. I was just telling my son that when we got married, we wanted to have kids, and it just never worked out. And then went to the doctors, went to this, tried a couple of things here. And then when Carrie finally said, okay, I'm just going to let it go, then it's almost like days she got pregnant. So once you let go of control, God can really work through us and do what He wants to do. But we are so much against giving up control because it's just hard. Because again, am I going to fall backwards and trust these people to catch me? Or is it going to be like situation comedy and they're not going to catch me and they're all arguing about it here? What am I going to do here? Well, God's much greater than that. We can trust God, but we have just got to let go of that control here. So that's what I want you to remember from this chapter here. Okay, so class is dismissed. We'll talk about chapter 8 next week.